Firouzja finds himself under immense pressure in this Title Tuesday game versus Grandmaster Sethuraman. How does he handle the pressure? Can he defend and come back? Let's see. He has the black pieces. Sethuraman has white. He plays e4, we'll jump right in. c5 is played by Firouzja, the Sicilian defense. Knight f3, e6, and d4. The main open Sicilian is played by white. Pawn takes, knight takes. And now knight to c6, the Taimanov system from Firouzja. The Khan system is a6. So you leave the knight on b8, maybe you go to d7 with it. But knight to c6 immediately puts pressure on the d4 knight and forces white to make some decisions regarding that piece. Sethuraman leaves it there, plays knight to c3, and now a6. And you'll notice by delaying the development of the d-pawn, he allows this bishop to potentially go to b4 and pin this knight at c3, which could be irritating for white. So he plays a3 to control the b4 square so the bishop can't go there. Knight g to e7, the idea to take on d4 and then replace that knight on c6. Bishop to e3. The attacking formation Sethuraman is after, I believe it'll be f4, bishop to d3, castles, and then just advance on the king side. b5, gaining space on the queen side and also allowing the bishop to come to b7. And Sethuraman plays the bishop to e2, a little more passive. I think he'd like to play the bishop to d3. The problem with this is after knight d4, bishop d4, knight to c6, the bishop moves back, and then knight to e5. And black has a comfortable position here. He's threatening to grab the two bishops. And to avoid all that, he plays the bishop to e2 first. That bishop can go to d3 later, but he doesn't want it to become a target. Bishop to b7, putting the bishop on the long diagonal, aiming at the e4 pawn. Castles, and rook to c8, controlling the half-open c-file. Perhaps the knight can go to a5 and c4 later. So computers like knight to b3 from white. This does control a5, but Sethuraman goes ahead and takes the knight on c6. He knows that knight can hop all around the position and cause some trouble, so he wants it off of the board. That does help black a little bit, though, because black has less space and he's trading pieces. Knight takes c6, and now f4. And we see a very standard attacking formation in the Sicilian. The queen would like to go to e1 and shift to g3 to attack the g7 pawn, and this pawn at e4 can go to e5, etc. So Firouzja plays the bishop to e7, and now Sethuraman moves that bishop on e2 a second time, getting it into a more ideal attacking formation. He liked to play e5 and attack the h7 pawn, and Firouzja's not worried about it. He just goes ahead and castles. He thinks he has enough defensive resources to deal with this position, and Sethuraman plays queen to h5. So if we just look at the position, white's formation looks like a pretty formidable attacking setup. He's potentially going to play e5, attacking h7. He also has the rook lift, rook f3, h3. The other rook from a1 can come over, and white can apply a lot of pressure to black's king here. So how does Firouzja deal with it? Well, let's see. First, he plays g6. He's going to defend the light squares with pawns and the dark squares with pieces. And he also gains a tempo against the queen. The queen goes to h3 to support an f4, f5 pawn push to try to break open these pawns on the king side. Well, how does Firouzja deal with the threat of f5? Well, he plays f5 himself, stopping that idea in its tracks before it gets going. White plays rook a to d1, placing the rook opposite the queen. The queen sidesteps, goes to c7. It can put pressure down the c-file and also aim at f4. ef5, and Firouzja, it would be a mistake to take with the e-pawn here. Not only does it leave a very weak pawn on d5, after knight to d5, he'd be in trouble. But when the queen moves, bishop to b6, forcing queen to e8, rook f to e1, and there's a pin on the e7 bishop, and he would just be lost there. So instead, he takes with the g-pawn, knowing it leaves his king a little more open, but it's the only real opportunity he has. Now, the traditional way for white to get at the king here, to crack open that attack on the king, would be to play g4, immediately putting pressure on this f5 pawn. That would be the standard way to do it. Perhaps Sethuraman was worried about how weak these light squares would become around his king, and that's a legitimate concern. So he plays a more creative attempt instead. He actually plays knight to d5, a piece sacrifice. It forks the queen and the bishop, so the piece does need to be taken. Pawn takes knight, bishop takes f5. So now Sethuraman is threatening mate on h7. He also could play bishop takes d7 if the mate threat is avoided. And Firouzja could try to keep the material with rook to f7. That was a legitimate possibility, just defending the h7 pawn. But he goes ahead and gives up the exchange here. And it's for a very good reason. After queen f5, the material is actually equal because both sides have sacrificed. White has a rook and pawn. Black has a knight and bishop. But you will notice this bishop on b7, this powerful light-squared bishop, now has no opponent. He gave up his rook for the light-squared bishop, so now this bishop doesn't have to deal with the other light-squared bishop. He can attack on light squares more easily. And what is his next move? d4, exactly. He unblocks the bishop at b7, and now it aims right at g2. It would be a mistake to take that pawn back, because after knight d4, rook d4, queen c2, with the bishop pair and pressure against g2, as well as the potential for trading queens, black is just completely winning in that position. So instead, Sethuraman plays rook to f3. And black does not have time to take the bishop, because after rook to g3, he would just be in big trouble, mated. So rook to f8 hits the queen, rook to g3 check, king to h8, queen to g4, which threatens mate on g7. So Firouzja plays bishop to f6 to defend against that mate. And now bishop f2. Now he can save the bishop because Firouzja really was threatening to take it. So here he plays a very strong move. It's one of those moves that it's a quiet move, but it really makes the defense work for black. He plays the move d6, threatening to go to c8 with the bishop, hitting the queen. Also, it allows his own queen to defend the king side laterally. A very powerful all-purpose move from Firouzja. Rook to h3, and now bishop to c8. Skewering the queen and the rook. It actually doesn't win material, but it does apply a lot of pressure to white. The reason it doesn't win material is because white can play f5, blocking the bishop. But now, the square on e5 is weakened, and a knight can jump in. Rook to g8, and we see Firouzja turning the tables on the white position. Now the rook is aiming at the g2 pawn. Queen to h5, now bishop to b7. The bishop goes back. Now this rook is on g8. The pressure on g2 is really intense. Computers say that bishop to h4, offering an exchange of dark squared bishops, is white's best defense. But Sethuraman plays bishop to g3, trying to block that bishop, the rook's access to g2, and it also puts some pressure on this diagonal aiming at the queen. But now knight to e5 is played by Firouzja. When white played f4, f5, it made that square available. Queen to h6, hitting the bishop. And the bishop can't go to g7 because then queen to h7 would be checkmate. So Firouzja defends actively. He plays knight to g4, attacking the queen and defending the bishop at f6 simultaneously. The queen goes back to d2, but now he plays a move that gives him a monster minor piece. Knight to e3. This knight is unbelievably powerful. It hits g2 along with the bishop, and of course the rook is putting pressure there. It hits the d1 rook, and it even adds pressure to the c2 pawn. That knight cannot be tolerated for long. Rook to e1 to save the rook, but then bishop takes g2, and white has really no choice here. He has to get rid of that knight, even if it means an exchange. So he plays rook takes e3, and Firouzja takes the rook at h3 in this position, keeping the bishop pair. Rook to e6, attacking the bishop at f6, so queen to f7 to defend. Rook takes d6, bishop to f5, and we see Firouzja here with an extra minor piece. But Sethuraman has tricks, and Firouzja still has to be careful. He plays queen to f4. Now that looks like trouble. If the bishop at f5, which is attacked, moves, then the rook can take the bishop at f6, but that's easily solved. He just moves the f6 bishop instead, allowing the queen to defend the f5 bishop. Rook takes d4. So Sethuraman makes a calculation. He knows he's down material. So he gives up the other rook in an attempt to take advantage of the weak dark square. So bishop takes rook with check. Queen takes d4. Now, black plays queen to g7. Sethuraman would love to play bishop to e5 and pin that queen, and he would just be winning. The problem is his own bishop is pinned to his king. So he wants to move the king out of the way so he can play bishop to e5, pinning the queen. First, he has to move his own queen, because if queens get exchanged, it's just a lost endgame. Now, watch what Firouzja does. Watch how he handles this threat. He plays h6. What he wants to do, basically, is just move his king to h7 so that it's not on a dark square and there can be no pin. King to f2. Now, for the moment, bishop to e5 is threatened, winning the queen. But king to h7. He just sidesteps that pin. Bishop to e5. Now the queen can move to f7, setting up a discovery along the f-file. Queen to f4. Now bishop g6, offering the exchange of queens. And in this position, with queens coming off the board, Sethuraman resigned. All he could do would be to play bishop to f6, but then rook to f8 just pins everything and wins everything. A really amazing defensive performance from Alireza Firouzja. Interesting to see how he fights back against kingside pressure. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon.